The Climate Prediction Center, which is part of NOAA, currently has an El Niño Advisory in effect, with the pattern expected to keep strengthening through the end of the year. That one line of technical language is the thread running through every number in this video. It is why the National Hurricane Center is looking at an empty ocean as of 2 o'clock Eastern on July 27th, with no tropical development expected anywhere across the North Atlantic, the Caribbean, or the Gulf for the next 7 days. It is also why the National Weather Service has extreme heat warnings and heat advisories stacked across the middle of Texas, with heat risk running at levels 3 and 4 on a 4-level scale, and why ERCOT just broke its all-time electricity demand record twice in 2 days. Subscribe before you keep going, because this is a story I will be updating as August moves. This is the part of the story that almost no one is telling. Before we get into the details, I want to be upfront about something. Texas is hot in August. That is not news, that is a calendar. A heat advisory in the last week of July, taken entirely on its own, is nothing unusual, and if that were the whole story, I would not be making this video. What makes this particular setup worth a full breakdown is not the afternoon high. It is that 4 separate hazards, the heat, the electric grid, the fire outlook, and the hurricane season, are all being driven by the same ocean pattern at the same moment, and that pattern is strengthening rather than fading. The temperature is only the symptom that shows up on your phone. The engine underneath it is what we need to talk about. Start with what the forecast actually says, in the agency's own words. The Climate Prediction Center's monthly outlook for August puts elevated probabilities of above-average temperatures across the Gulf Coast and into parts of Texas, with the strongest heat signal centered over the southeast, Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, and extending west over the Gulf and into the state. On rainfall, the Climate Prediction Center places Texas and the southern plains in what it labels equal chances. That phrase is not a forecast of normal rain, and it is not a forecast of a dry month either. It is the agency stating plainly that it sees no reliable signal in either direction. Hold on to that phrase. The short-range picture is much sharper. The Weather Prediction Center issued its extended forecast discussion at 3:58 p.m. Eastern on July 27th, valid from July 30th through August 3rd. And it describes an upper-level ridge building out of the southern plains and southern Rockies toward the southwest, the west, the Rockies, and the high plains. The words that discussion uses for what rides along with that ridge are lengthy and anomalously potent. That is not language for a 2-day spike. It describes a pattern that sets up and refuses to move. The numbers underneath that language are already on the board. The Weather Prediction Center and the National Weather Service are showing highs of 95 to 105 degrees, with heat index values of 105 to 115 across the affected region, and 115 to 120 degrees over the desert southwest. HeatRisk, which is the National Weather Service scale for how dangerous heat is to human bodies rather than to thermometers, is sitting at major and extreme, levels 3 and 4 out of 4. At those levels, the agency's own framing is that the heat is dangerous to anyone without adequate cooling or hydration. Not only to the elderly, not only to the ill, and not only to people working outdoors. That is where the state sits as of this recording. City by city, the local offices have been specific. Dallas-Fort Worth is under a heat advisory as of July 27th, with highs of 97 to 103 degrees, heat index values of 106 to 108, overnight lows between 75 and 82, and index readings expected near 110 by the middle and end of the week. Austin was placed under an extreme heat warning on July 22nd, with a high of 104 and a heat index reaching 115, covering Bastrop, Fayette, Lavaca, Lee, Travis, and Williamson counties. San Antonio and the Hill Country went under a heat advisory on July 23rd, with heat index values of 108 to 114 along the Interstate 35 corridor. Houston and southeast Texas were placed under an extreme heat warning on July 22nd, with triple-digit highs across Harris, Fort Bend, Galveston, and Montgomery counties. Every one of those products is being reissued and revised daily, and the ridge the Weather Prediction Center describes has not finished building yet. Here is the mechanism, and it is simpler than the jargon makes it sound. Picture the atmosphere over the southern United States right now as a pot of water with a heavy glass lid dropped over the top of it. A ridge of high pressure is that lid. Air inside a ridge sinks, and sinking air gets compressed by the weight of the atmosphere stacked above it, and compressed air heats up. That is not sunlight doing the work, that is pressure alone. You have felt this with a bicycle pump. Press the handle down fast and the barrel gets warm, and no sunlight touched it. Now take that pump and scale it up to a column of air 1,000 miles across and several miles deep, and let it press down on Texas for a week without lifting. The lid does a second thing that matters even more than the heating. Sinking air suppresses cloud formation, and clouds are the only shade a landscape has. Without them, sunlight reaches the ground unfiltered, hour after hour, day after day. Soil, asphalt, brick, and concrete all behave like batteries for heat. They charge through the afternoon and they discharge overnight. But when a surface has been charging for 6 or 8 days straight with no cloudy afternoon to interrupt the cycle, the discharge never finishes before sunrise, and the next morning starts from a higher floor than the one before it. That is why a heat wave keeps getting worse even when the weather pattern itself stops changing. Which brings me to the single number in this entire forecast package that gets the least attention and does the most damage. Look again at the Dallas-Fort Worth advisory. The overnight lows run from 75 to 82 degrees. Human beings do not survive heat by enduring the afternoon. We survive it by unloading at night. Core body temperature drops during sleep, the cardiovascular system stops working overtime to push blood toward the skin, and the body pays back the thermal debt it built up between noon and dusk. But that repayment only works if the surrounding air is meaningfully cooler than the skin. At 79 degrees with Gulf humidity locked in a house with a struggling window unit, it is not. So the debt carries into the next morning, and the next day adds to it. Heat mortality research going back to the Chicago event of 1995 and the European wave of 2003 keeps landing on the same finding. The death curve tracks consecutive warm nights far more tightly than it tracks the single hottest afternoon on the chart. Texas is running those nights back to back right now. The heat index deserves a proper explanation too, because it gets dismissed as an exaggeration. It is not a hyped-up temperature. It is an answer to a specific physical question. How hot would dry air have to be to stress your body the way this actual humid air is stressing it? Sweat only cools you when it evaporates, and evaporation slows down as the surrounding air fills with water vapor. So when the Austin office reports an air temperature of 104 and a heat index of 115, it is telling you that your personal cooling system is being asked to perform as though it were 115 degrees, because the humidity has stripped away part of your ability to sweat effectively. The number is not drama, it is arithmetic about your own body. HeatRisk runs on that same logic, one step further out. It is a 4-level scale that blends how hot it is with how unusual that heat is for that specific place and that specific week of the year, and then weighs how long it lasts. Level 1 is a risk to a small number of people. Level 2 is a risk to those who are already sensitive to heat. Level 3, major, means anyone without effective cooling and hydration is at risk, and infrastructure starts feeling it. Level 4, extreme, means rare, long-duration heat that is dangerous to the entire population regardless of age or health. Texas is currently sitting in the top 2 boxes of a 4-box scale, and the state does not usually spend consecutive weeks up there. There is one more piece to this machine, and it is under your feet. The U.S. Drought Monitor Bulletin dated July 23rd places 38.3% of the United States and Puerto Rico in moderate drought or worse, 45.77% of the lower 48 states, with roughly 114 million people living inside drought-affected areas and conditions deteriorating across the northern plains and upper Midwest. Dry ground changes the physics of a heat wave. Where there is moisture in the soil, a large share of incoming solar energy goes into evaporating that water instead of raising the air temperature, the same reason a wet towel on the back of your neck works. Where the ground is already dry, that energy has nowhere to go except straight into heating the air. Drought makes heat waves hotter. Hotter heat waves deepen the drought, and the loop tightens a little more every day the ridge holds. But here's the part that almost no one is covering, and it is the reason this video is pointed at August rather than at this week. On July 21st, ERCOT, the operator that runs roughly 90% of the Texas electric grid, recorded a peak demand of 87,403 megawatts. That broke an all-time record of 85,508 megawatts that had stood since the 10th of August 2023. The very next day, July 22nd, the grid went past it again at roughly 91,308 megawatts. 2 all-time records in 2 consecutive days, and ERCOT's own official projection for this summer sits above 92.2 gigawatts, a level the system has still not touched. To give that a shape you can actually hold, 92.2 gigawatts is roughly the electricity consumption of about 18.4 million homes running at the same time. Texas has somewhere near 12 million households, which means the peak ERCOT is projecting sits well beyond the entire residential base of the state, because industry, data centers, oil field electrification, refrigeration and commercial cooling all stack on top of what people use at home. Every one of those loads climbs when the temperature climbs, and the temperature, according to the Climate Prediction Center, has elevated odds of running above average through the whole month ahead. Now look at the date on the record that fell, August 10th, 2023. August, not July. That is not a coincidence, and it is the entire spine of this story. August is historically the ceiling month for the Texas grid, because by then the ground has been charging all summer, the overnight floor never fully resets, and air conditioners across 4 major metros start running closer to continuous duty than to cycling. What happened on the 21st and 22nd of July was the run-up, not the summit. The month that has historically produced the annual maximum has not even started. But I want to be extremely careful here, because this is where a lot of coverage goes wrong, and I am not going to sell you something the data does not support. 2 record days did not put the Texas grid in trouble. On the day the record fell, ERCOT was carrying more than 20 gigawatts of spare capacity, issued no emergency notice, and made no request for public conservation. The system did exactly what it is designed to do. And honestly, that is a far more interesting story than a blackout. Because back in 2023, with a record roughly 6 gigawatts smaller than the one set this July, Texas came uncomfortably close to rolling outages. Same state, higher demand, calmer grid. Something structural changed in 3 years. What changed is visible in the other records that broke during that same week. Maximum solar output hit 34,665 megawatts. Maximum battery storage discharge hit 11,980 megawatts. And peak net load, that is total demand minus whatever wind and solar are contributing, meaning the portion that thermal plants actually have to cover, came in at 75,733 megawatts, roughly 16 gigawatts below the raw peak. Solar production tracks a Texas heat wave almost perfectly, because the identical cloudless ridge that bakes the state also delivers close to ideal conditions for panels. The batteries then carry the handoff into the evening, when the sun drops out but the demand does not. That is the machine that held in July. Whether it holds at 92.2 gigawatts, in the month that historically sets the ceiling, under heat the Weather Prediction Center is already describing as lengthy and anomalously potent, is the genuine open question of the next few weeks. The second cascade is already burning, and most of it is not in Texas yet. The National Interagency Fire Center's National Significant Wildland Fire Potential Outlook places an extended band of above-normal significant fire potential across the southern tier of the country for July and August, running from the Texas Hill Country all the way to South Florida, driven by heat waves, drier-than-normal conditions, and the lingering effects of drought. This is not a new call either. The Fire Center's outlook back in January of 2026 was already projecting above-normal potential for much of Texas this summer. In the southern high plains, the same agency is reporting elevated fire weather with relative humidity dropping as low as 15%, which is the threshold where cured grass stops resisting ignition in any meaningful way. Nationally, the picture is already pinned at the top of the scale. The National Interagency Fire Center has held the country at Preparedness Level 5, the highest of 5, since July 18th. As of July 26th, there were 90 large active fires, with 25,310 personnel mobilized, including 565 crews, 1,501 engines, 141 helicopters, and 27 incident management teams. Year-to-date, the country has recorded 42,157 fires and 50,260 acres burned, against a 10-year average of 3,355,239 acres for this same point on the calendar. That is roughly 700,000 acres ahead of pace, with the hottest stretch of the year still in front of us. And Preparedness Level 5 carries a practical meaning most people never hear explained. National firefighting resources are already committed, so any new large fire competes for crews and aircraft that are assigned somewhere else. The Fire Center publishes its next outlook on the 1st of August, and those numbers will move. Which brings us to the ocean, and to the strangest piece of this entire picture. The Gulf is quiet, not calm, quiet. The National Hurricane Center's tropical weather outlook as of 2 p.m. Eastern on July 27th shows no tropical cyclone formation expected over the next 7 days anywhere across the North Atlantic Basin, the Caribbean Sea, or the Gulf of Mexico. And the seasonal forecast agrees with that silence. NOAA's outlook, released on May 21st, calls for 8 to 14 named storms against a historical average of 14, 3 to 6 hurricanes against an average of 7, and 1 to 3 major hurricanes of Category 3 or stronger against an average of 3. The agency assigns a 55% chance to a below-normal season, 35% to near-normal, and 10% to above normal. By every seasonal metric NOAA publishes, 2026 is shaping up as a slow year in the Atlantic. But here's what that headline number does not tell you, and this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. A below-normal season is a statement about count, not about consequence. NOAA states explicitly and in writing that its seasonal outlook is not a landfall forecast. It does not say where anything goes, because that is not something the science can do months in advance. 2 names are already spent this year, Arthur and Bertha. The next ones waiting on the list are Cristobal, Dolly, Edward, Faye, Gonzalo, Hannah, Isaias, Josephine, Kyle, Leah, Marco, Nana, Omar, Paulette, Renee, Sally, Teddy, Vicky, and Wilfred. The season runs from the 1st of June to the 30th of November, and the climatological peak lands on the 10th of September. August is the doorway into that window, not the exit from it. Ken Graham, the director of the National Weather Service, compressed the whole problem into one sentence in NOAA's official seasonal release. It only takes one storm to make for a very bad season. A quiet gulf in the last week of July is not a forecast for the last week of August. It is a description of a 7-day window that is already expiring. Think for a second about the position that man is in when he says it. He runs the National Weather Service. His own agency has just told the public that fewer storms than usual are expected, and that the odds sit at 55% for the quiet scenario. The easy thing to do with a calm forecast is to let people relax into it. Instead, the sentence he put into the official release was that it only takes one storm. That is somebody who understands that no family on the coast has ever lived through a season. They live through one storm, or they live through none. And there is a second kind of person buried in this data who never gets named in any press release. Picture a one-story house in East Harris County, built in the early 1960s, a window unit humming in the front room and nothing at all in the back bedrooms. The afternoon high outside reads 101 on the Houston forecast, with the heat index well past it. Inside the front room it holds around 84, and the back rooms sit warmer than that. At 2 in the morning, the outdoor temperature has fallen only to 79 with the humidity locked in, so the unit is still running, still losing ground, and the person asleep in the back bedroom has now gone roughly 60 hours without their core temperature dropping the way the body requires. Nothing dramatic happens on the first night, nothing dramatic happens on the second. That house is why the National Weather Service built duration into the heat risk scale instead of ranking days by peak temperature. Those overnight minimums are forecast to stay between 75 and 82 across North Texas through the week ahead. To keep this danger properly in proportion, let me be honest about the base rates. Heat advisories in Texas during the last week of July are routine, and the existence of one is not evidence of anything unusual. ERCOT setting a new demand record is close to an annual event in a state adding population and industrial load every year. What is unusual here is not any single item on that list. It is the duration the Weather Prediction Center is describing, the fact that the run-up is landing in July rather than August, and the fact that one ocean pattern is standing behind all of it at once. What the data does and does not tell us is worth stating flatly. It can tell you the ridge is building and roughly how long it holds. It cannot tell you which day the Texas grid sets its annual peak. It can tell you the Atlantic is more likely than not to produce fewer storms than average this year. It cannot tell you whether one of them turns toward the Texas coast, and NOAA says exactly that in its own release. The Climate Prediction Center's equal chances call on August rainfall is arguably the most honest line in the whole package, a federal agency stating plainly that it does not know. So anyone handing you a specific August date for a hurricane or an outage is not reading the same documents I am. And for the contrast case that teaches the most transferable lesson, look at 1992. By the count, it was one of the quietest Atlantic seasons on record. Exactly the kind of year a seasonal outlook would have flagged as low. The storm people still talk about from that year is Andrew. A low number in the seasonal column has never protected a single mile of coastline, and it was never designed to. So here is what you actually do with this, and none of it is about fear. First, stop checking tomorrow's high and start checking tonight's low. If your forecast low stays above 75 degrees for 3 consecutive nights, treat it as one cumulative exposure event rather than 3 separate hot days, because that is how your body is treating it. Second, find your nearest cooling center now and confirm the hours, because the afternoon you need one is the worst possible afternoon to start searching. Third, pre-cool the house in the morning and shift laundry, dishwashing, and vehicle charging to before noon or after 9 at night. That trims your bill, and it pulls load off the evening window where net demand peaks. Fourth, and this is the counterintuitive one, if your cooling is struggling, stop trying to cool the whole house. Pick one room, seal it, shade the windows, put the strongest unit you have on it, and sleep everyone in there. A single room held at 74 degrees overnight does more for survival than an entire house held at 84. Fifth, keep vehicles off dry grass and check that nothing is dragging behind a trailer, because at 15% relative humidity in the southern high plains, a catalytic converter or a bouncing safety chain is a legitimate ignition source, and most large grass fires start at a roadside. Sixth, clear anything flammable within 30 feet of the structure while the mornings are still workable. Seventh, build the hurricane kit in August, not in September when a name shows up on a map, and check your flood coverage now. Standard homeowners policies typically exclude flood, and flood policies generally carry a waiting period of around 30 days before they take effect. Confirm the exact terms with your own insurer, but understand that buying coverage after a storm is named is functionally the same as not buying it. And last, check on the neighbors over 65 and ask the specific question instead of the polite one. Not whether they are doing all right, but whether their air conditioning is actually working. All of it comes back to one thing, and this is where the pieces lock together. The Climate Prediction Center's ENSO discussion has an El Niño Advisory in effect, states that the pattern will keep strengthening through the end of the year, and puts a 97% chance on it persisting into early spring of 2027. El Niño loads the upper atmosphere over the Atlantic with vertical wind shear, and shear tears the tops off, developing tropical systems before they can organize, which is precisely why NOAA is forecasting a below-normal season. The same pattern helps park heat ridges over the southern United States. One ocean signal suppressing the storms and feeding the heat at the same time. And it is not one-sided either. NOAA notes that slightly above normal ocean temperatures and weaker than average trade winds are pushing in the opposite direction, which is exactly why the forecast is a range and not a certainty. So here is what I am watching over the coming days, and what you should be watching with me. The National Interagency Fire Center publishes its next significant fire potential outlook on the 1st of August, and whether that band from the hill country to Florida holds, expands, or shifts is the single most useful fire signal available. The Climate Prediction Center updates its monthly outlooks at the turn of the month, and if that equal chances rainfall call for Texas moves in either direction, the drought and fire picture moves with it. NOAA revises its hurricane season forecast in early August, and that revision arrives right as the climatological window starts opening. And ERCOT posts a daily peak. Watch how close it runs to 92.2 gigawatts. This is not a story with an ending yet, and what comes next is not written. Subscribe so the update finds you, keep an eye on that overnight low tonight, and stay safe out there.